And so as this says, cybersecurity really requires that people, processes, and technology, and we've heard of these three components before as we've talked through chapters in this course, that these three components combine and continually monitor for vulnerabilities and then be proactive about ensuring that to the extent we can, we are not victims of cybercrime. Cybersecurity is a highly technical, specialized field, and that's very true. I mean, there are entire master's degree programs and many doctorates have been written on specialized topics related to cybersecurity. So it's not our intention in this course to try to become an expert in this, but just to establish some foundational understanding and background on it. And then again, we talk about the confidential nature of data stored in accounting systems. You know, in those, for a lot of reasons. One, we have payroll information, so we have people's wages, their social security numbers, you know, very personal information about people in the accounting system that needs to be protected. We also have very confidential information about an organization's performance, and sometimes it's all of this information combined together that gives a corporation its competitive advantage, and so we need to safeguard that as much as we can. And in order to help us to kind of wrap our hands around this very wide field of cybersecurity, we can use a model, right? Something that kind of just can help us think about what are the areas related to the field as it stands now. It's like everything else, you know, as the industry continues to advance, as new crimes are committed, and as technology advances, obviously so are the attempts to hack that technology. And so it's really a changing dynamic environment. But at this point in time, what we've done is we're going to adopt this ISC, Internal Information Systems security domains, or 10 domains of cybersecurity. And here we have these 10 domains listed here. There's you may find it helpful. There's this acronym: Learn Info Security Tech, Avoid Oops Please, Accountants Beware, Cybercrime, which is not very helpful to me, but maybe you'll find it helpful in kind of staying on top of what these 10 domains of security are. So, for instance, we deal with legal, regulations, compliance, and investigations, and that really focuses on cybercrime and cyber law. Or we talk about information security and risk management, which really focuses on preventative and proactive policies and procedures that are meant to manage our information and manage our risk. And so we can go on with each of these as we will to understand in a way that we're able to wrap our hands around the whole discipline of cybersecurity. And so this just presents us with a table of the 10 different domains down the left and a domain description down the right. So we'll begin going over some of these now. And so when we talk about the first domain of legal, regulations, compliance, and investigations, we're really talking about cyber crimes, which are crimes connected to information assets and IT, or cyber laws, the laws and regulations to prevent, investigate, and prosecute cyber crimes. And then cyber forensics, which involves collecting, examining, preserving evidence of cyber crimes. And the cyber forensics you can think of as akin to accounting forensics, right? So where there's fraud or embezzlement or some other type of illegal act, we have accounting forensics that can go in and gather historical data, apply audit techniques, trace money trails, go through several steps to try to recreate the crime. And that's no different than what cyber forensics is. That's collecting, examining, and preserving evidence of cyber crimes. And so this is really what we're talking about, these three areas: cyber crimes, cyber laws, and cyber forensics, when we talk about legal, regulations, compliance, and investigations domain. So when we talk cyber crime, we're really talking about successful breaches that involve an attacker exploiting a mistake made by a victim organization. And here's where we see that attackers are adept at exploiting mistakes, such as unsecured wireless networks. And we see that they're increasingly innovative and creative about how they can attack a network. And so that's why we also see routinely that whether it's Microsoft often coming up with updates to its software application in order to prevent the widespread hacking of it. We see organizations staying on top of this and trying to update their systems in order to prevent this. And so some well-known cyber attacks involving cybercrime include items like salami attacks, where I'm sure you've heard of instances where a system may round its monetary transactions to 10 decimal places, and that one example of a salami attack is when the hacker rounds it lower and takes the differential and puts it into an account differently, a different account in their name. And that's this idea of salami attacks. It typically involve very small amounts over numerous accounts that accumulate into significant sums. Then we have the idea of social engineering, which is really manipulating an individual into divulging confidential information to be used for fraudulent purposes. And this idea of phishing, or phishing, which are really fake IT email requests to email back information regarding an account, that's an example of this idea of social engineering. And then we also have examples that are called dumpster diving, where we're rummaging through garbage for discarded documents or digital material, or password sniffing, which are attempts to obtain passwords by sniffing messages sent between computers on the email or on networks. And so there are multiple examples of this cyber crime and some of the terminology around them that are covered in the readings. We then talk about cyber law, and the issue with cyber laws is that they are often playing catch up after the cyber attacks occur. But we have laws that originate in legislation, in regulation, and in case law. But again, these are usually after the attack has occurred and the damage has already been suffered. And then, so in hindsight, we're trying as a society to better position us so that this doesn't happen again another time. And these are some examples of legislation or law that could be considered, right, as an attack on cyber crime, such as the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, the Graham-Leach-Bliley Act, Payment Card Industry Data Security Standards, and then the Federal Information Security Management Act. And these are all just examples of legislation or regulation that has been passed by the federal government in order to better protect us against cybercrime, which really shows the importance and the increasing significance of this to us as a society. And so many organizations find that if they're a target of a cyber attack, they don't have in-house personnel who have specific expertise to conduct these cyber forensics investigations, and so they'll bring in an outside consultant to assist in the investigation. And here again, we talk cyber forensics. We're looking at the crime, we're looking at what happened, we're gathering information and gathering data on how did it happen, how could it have been stopped, where would it have been detected, what are the damages as a result of it, are we able to point to any culprits. Now, it really is just sort of a historical way of investigating the cyber attack to determine what our next steps should be. And so the next domain deals with information security and risk management, and we'll talk about enterprise risk management later in Chapter 12. But here what we're really talking about is how some organizations who are experiencing repeated attempts every day institute some preventive and proactive measures at becoming more and more able to prevent the cyber attacks from occurring. And they do this through this idea of information security, so being policies and procedures to secure information assets, including the IT hardware, software, and data we see, and information risk management, which really tries to identify these risks associated with cyber attacks and then through its risk management program address them. So there are a couple of fundamental principles associated with information security, and one way to keep them in mind is this CIA mnemonic. It's confidentiality, so sensitive information at each point in the data processing is secure and protected from unauthorized access is one of our goals. Integrity, we want to make sure that the data is accurate and reliable. And then availability, so that's the CIA. And with respect to availability, we want required data is available as needed by the organization's users, such as accountants. If the data is destroyed, data can be restored so it's available. And so these, again, are just the fundamental principles of information security. So it's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So there are other types of information security controls, and they include things like administrative controls or security policies, standards, guidelines, and procedures to screen employees and provide security training. There's technical or logical controls, which are security policy, standards, or guidelines, procedures for access control and configuration of the IT infrastructure. And so this is, the hardware and the software, and how do we need to configure all of that so that we have established these technical or logical controls to guard against cyber attacks. And then there are physical controls, and that literally is exactly when we say that, physical controls. It's physically having access to the computer facility, being able to guard against environmental damage, perhaps as a result of flooding, or we have a backup AC system if our primary AC system goes down, so our computer room doesn't overheat. Or we have intrusion detection, so that if someone breaks into our computer facility, we have a way of knowing about that and alerting someone before the physical hardware can be damaged or destroyed or taken. And then we're also provided these frameworks around security to help give us this conceptual structure to address security and control. So we talked about COBIT and COSO in previous chapters, and again, these are just frameworks. They're just ways of thinking about security. And then we have the International Standards of Organization, ISO 27000, which again is an internationally recognized standard regarding information security management systems that provide us with these guidelines that we might want to think about implementing in order, one, to maintain that we're ISO 27000 compliant, but more importantly, does recognizing these guidelines and trying to do something about them expose gaps in our own systems. So then we have the idea of security architecture and design domain, and this can be compared to an architectural blueprint of your home. So instead of electrical wiring, you have network wiring. Instead of closets, you have data storage. Instead of doors, you have access points to the enterprise system. And so the issue becomes one, well, around this architecture, around these networks and around our information flows and our databases and our computers, what are the security procedures and protocols that are intended to protect this architecture? So when we talk about network architecture, we're really talking about interconnected computers and devices, right? That's what our network is. And so we have three categories of networks: LANs, MANs, and WANs. And the difference between these include issues such as network size, the number of computers involved, the protocol used for transmission and receiving of messages, the bits transferred per second, and the type of router. For example, a protocol used by a computer to transmit over a LAN or a local area network is the Ethernet, and a protocol used by a computer to transmit over a WAN or a wide area network is the TCP/IP protocol. So, there are very different technical considerations over this, but from our perspective, we want to have background, want to understand some of the differences between them at a very fundamental level to help us to the extent it comes up in the design of our accounting system. And so a LAN connects a few computers together in a small area, such as a building or a building floor or even a room. All computers attached to one LAN must run exactly the same LAN protocol. The LAN protocol is called a MAC, or Medium Access Control Protocol, and this protocol allows a computer to transmit over a LAN. The most used MAC, or Medium Access Control Protocol, is Ethernet. In a MAN, or metropolitan area network, many small networks are connected to each other. These smaller networks are connected together by routers. A much more powerful router connects one man to another man. And then we have this idea of a WAN, or a wide area network. A wide area network covers a region such as a multi-state region. In a WAN, many MANs are connected to each other. These MANs are connected to each other by powerful routers. The router correcting MANs on a WAN is called a node. Each node works as a distribution center. And so a WAN is governed by specific authority. The WAN authority would decide for the overall protocol running that WAN. So a WAN is also called an internet. Each internet has its own routing and transmitting protocol. The internet, which runs TCP/IP, is called the internet, or with an uppercase. And so we can see there are some scalability items between wide area network, metropolitan area network, and local area network. And so then we move on to the network and internet security domain. And this domain covers the security for telecommunications, network, and the internet. And this really deals with exactly what we say, telecommunications. So how do we transmit? What are the protocols and the safety and security that's in effect regarding the exchange of emails, right? Or the exchange of documents over email. And so when we're talking about this, a network access point without a firewall is like a house with an open entrance door. And that's why we see when we're talking network security, we have to talk about ideas like network access points. How do we access the system? We have to talk about routers, bridges, and gateways, because these are all of these access points to our network. And then we have to talk about firewalls, and these firewalls control the traffic between two networks and are installed on routing devices to prevent unauthorized access. So e-commerce without firewalls is like a store without merchandise security tags and the tag checking gate. A website behind a high security firewall is like a store showcase without any window. And so we see that we can't dispute firewalls are important in e-commerce, because it's e-commerce which are often the prime targets for cyber attacks. But we also have to be mindful that if we are in e-commerce, we want our website to be easily accessed by the public, easily accessible, and easy to use. And so if we make getting to that and make that use too difficult, we're going to turn off our customer. And so generally the website is in front of the firewall, but of course that then offers up the issue that cyber attackers can deface our website. So to address this dilemma, we talked that the enterprise places its websites behind low-level security firewalls, which is the first firewall to the outside world, which makes it somewhat difficult for cyber attackers to get to our website. And then higher security firewalls are installed to prevent payment data and customer account information. And so that information is stored on a server behind a much higher, more restricted firewall. And so next we move on to this idea of control access domain. And this addresses security for access to the enterprise system, right? Threats to this enterprise system include network sniffers that examine traffic on our network, phishing to obtain confidential information, and identity theft. And so again, we're trying to, through control access theory and practice, secure our system, our enterprise system, against these cyber attacks. And these principles that we use in this security are things like identification, authentication, authorization, and accountability. For a user to be allowed access to a secured system, that is to computers or networks, the user should be identified, authenticated, and then authorized to access the system. And we do some of that through this idea of password management. And you all have seen this before, I know, on practically everything that you do, whether it's to access the school Moodle, to access this online course, or to access your account on school, or to access your account on Amazon. This whole idea of passwords is inescapable today. And so there we have to take into account items like, well, how many passwords do you have? I know I probably have 20 or 30 passwords that I have to write down somewhere and by website so that I can remember all of them. What are our requirements that our users, and how frequently they must change their password, and what is that format? And then what happens after a certain number of incorrect login attempts? And so these are just some of the issues that you have to deal with in this password management arena. And again, all this is related to access control domain. These are some more examples where we have this password management. We deal with dynamic passwords, so that when it's used once, it then has to be changed. We deal with this idea of a token device, which says that, well, every time we use a password, the password is recreated, or our old password is no longer good, and we buy new passwords with tokens. Or this idea of single sign-on, which permits the user to use one username and password to log on to various systems. And so these, again, are sort of tools or methods of managing passwords. We also talk in terms of biometrics, and I'm sure you all have heard about this, where some of the major computer manufacturers now, instead of having to have a password, are trying to allow users to log on with the use of a fingerprint as a way of identifying the user. So we talk about these biometrics as personal attributes, and they include things like fingerprints or face recognitions or retina scans or palm scans. And so this is another maybe trending future way that we're going to have be able to eliminate some of the inherent problems to passwords. And then finally, we talk about these intrusion prevention systems, also related to access control domain. And we talk about that in terms of intrusion prevention systems, which is an attempt to prevent cyber attacks from occurring at all. We talk about intrusion detection systems, which are not really good because the attack has already happened. But if the attack is going to happen anyway, I would much rather know it's happened and be able to find that out through some routine, systematic way of monitoring my account usage than to find out otherwise. And then we see that these intrusion prevention systems can include sniffers used by the enterprise to detect malicious messages on its own network, and then allowing the system to destroy the message before it causes any harm. Then we move to this idea of operations security domain, and it refers to the activities and procedures required to keep information technology running securely. And so IT security management includes responsibility for maintaining security in devices and software, such as virus detection systems, firewall systems, IPS and IDS systems. And this security assessment is carried out on a scheduled basis to evaluate the security of the various components of the enterprise system. And then finally, we talk about security operational responsibilities and how they relate to the enterprise system and the way it operates. And this area includes input-output controls, software licenses, and how are we accounting for those, and are we current on those, and we're not violating any laws or regulations surrounding those. It includes this idea of training all employees regarding their security clearances or procedures, conducting vulnerability checks, and then determining contingency plans for cyber attacks. That is, how are we going to recover from it once we've determined that we have been attacked? So, physical and environmental security domain addresses the physical security of hard information technology components such as hardware and software. And so there we see things like, and I know at Virginia International University, you go into their computer lab, there are cameras mounted in the computer lab in order to ensure that there's no theft or misuse or abuse of the computers. And so that's this idea of physical and environmental security. We also talk environmental security to ensure that, well, is the hardware in a secure area that is safe from environmental abuse, such as fire and flood, some man-made and non-man-made threats. Another way to think about that is that, well, and again, on the lab the door going into the computer room, there's a note there that says, please no food or drinks in room. And that's an example of a policy and procedure that's executed aimed at trying to protect the environmental and physical security of our system. And so application security domain talks about items which are related to security and controls for application software. And that includes the input, processing, and output. And so this application software includes our accounting system that we're designing and any software spreadsheets that we may use on a daily basis. And so, what is it that is in place to preserve the integrity of the application? And sometimes what you'll see are updates that are run routinely that are meant to upgrade the software in order to protect against vulnerability that may have been identified that just didn't exist at the time you bought the software and installed it. And so that's a good example of a policy or a procedure designed to maintain the application security integrity of the system. And so with this application security, we talk in terms of malware, which is malicious software, right, that could be spread throughout an enterprise by abuses related to email or fake advertisements, internet downloads, and shared drive. And these types of malware include things like viruses, bots, worms, logic bombs, Trojan horses, and spam. And bots, which are short for robots, are tiny pieces of programming code which installs itself on a zombie or an infected computer. They monitor this infected computer and then transmit information back to the hacker's computer. And so it's because of bots and how what this infected code may be doing that it's important for users to turn their computers off when they leave, because these bots can sometimes activate themselves to run when the computer's on in the middle of the night, when we don't even realize that the system could be subject to a cyber attack. When we talk about viruses, we're talking about a small computer program that infects other application software by attaching to and disrupting the application's function. We can also buy antivirus software that can detect and remove viruses. When we're talking about logic bombs, we're talking about malware that executes when a specified event happens within the computer. For example, when we log on to our bank account, perhaps that invokes some programming code that's meant to act as an attack on our system. We have this idea of Trojan Horses, which are malware designed as legitimate program that you're downloading and installing, but not realizing at the time that it's a virus and that it does something later on, and you may not even know it does it, but it does something later on that will damage the hardware or the software or otherwise negatively impact our computer. And then we have this idea of spam, which is malware sent by email, and a spam can be either a virus, a bot, a logic worm, a logic bomb, a worm, or a Trojan horse. And so I'm sure all of you who have been working with computers all your life have had instances where your computer had to be debugged, where you had to run some anti-malware, antivirus, or some anti-malware product on your computer to clear out some of these. And then we talk about the idea of the business continuity and disaster recovery domain. And this really addresses the enterprise's way of, literally as it says, continuing to stay in business and recovering from a disaster when some cyber attack or even a natural disaster happens. So, and we talked that any disaster recovery plan should have goals related to the minimization of disruption and damage. We should be able to have identified a temporary method for processing business and accounting transactions, and we should have some plan in place that will allow us to resume normal operations quickly. And so these are the key parts or elements to a disaster recovery or business continuity plan that we need to think about and make sure that we have covered. We also deal with, under continuity and recovery domain, backup methods. And so we can see that, and there's no debate, I hope, on anyone's part that accounting backups are critical and should be scheduled on a regular basis. And then we have this grandfather, father, son method, which really just kind of tiers the status of particular backups depending on when they are taken relative to others. And so you can see how, if we backed up at the end of each day, how that terminology would apply and how it would recycle based on each day's backup. And we have to remember that anymore, only one backup file is not adequate, because if that backup file fails, then we have no recovery from that. So we should think in terms of multiple backup plans. And so here we see some examples of backup facilities. So reciprocity agreements or reciprocal agreements, which are between organizations to provide backup services, internal sites to back up within the same organization to other sites within that organization, this use of hot site, warm site, and cold site. So we have several options available to us. And we really should consider these in light of what our business operations model is and what our needs are in order to keep our business going in the case of some type of disaster or cyber attack. So data transfer is at a higher risk because that's really leading our operations or leading our company and going out over probably public lines. So if you have a password on your wireless network, the data may be encrypted in transit. And as cyber attacks become more sophisticated, the attacks are sometimes going all the way to the database. So this has prompted some organizations to even encrypt data stored in their database, not just in transit. And so to this idea of cryptography is the encoding of data in a form that only the sender and intended receiver can understand. And that's once it's been encrypted, it needs to be decrypted. And this is done by decoding the encryption by the use of the key. And so here we see that encryption is a method of converting plain text data into an unreadable form called ciphertext, which is then converted back to plain text using decryption, which involves the use of what we call a key. And so it's important to note then that accounting systems contain some of the enterprise's most confidential data. The IT used can actually create vulnerabilities to cyber attacks on confidential accounting information, and for this reason, accountants need to be prudent when implementing new technologies until it's been tested and proven reliable enough to adequately safeguard accounting data. And so that concludes Chapter 11 on cybersecurity. I do encourage you to go back and read your text very closely because it talks about a lot of these areas in a lot more detail. And this is a growing area of importance, both importance to senior management, which by definition should make it more important to us at the operating or mid-level management level. So it's important to understand the background and some concepts related to it, although I do also point out at a certain point this whole idea of cyber attacks, cyber security, cybercrime, cyber law, and all the domains of that we talked about can become very technically detailed. And again, that's pointed out to the master's and doctoral level degrees that are awarded nowadays in cybersecurity. And so, I don't expect, and I don't, the purpose of this course is not that we make students experts in cybersecurity. It's simply to raise their awareness of and their appreciation for having addressed it in the design of the accounting system or any other system that we may be connected with that on which an organization's valuable company confidential and business propriety information is maintained. So I appreciate your time. Please go back and read the text and then move on to the learning exercises. And thanks very much.